In terms of health, I should make the caveat that I'm not a health researcher, I'm not a health expert, but I'm making clear that in this case, I'm defining health in the wider sense of the term. It's not just about absence of disease or infirmity, it's well-being. And that's really something that we need to integrate all areas of policy with health. And a big problem in the UK, and I'm sure in the Canadian context as well, is that health tends to be siloed into its own department that doesn't talk to or see the links between different departments. So that's from the World Health Organization. And in reality, we need to shift based on this definition that was first put together in 1946. I think that, if anything, we've gone more towards tackling the symptoms of ill health rather than tackling the root cause of bad health. So that's definitely something that we're trying to do, and one of the motivations behind my research is to say, well, and it applies also to environmental issues, let's tackle the root cause of the problem rather than the symptoms. And the transport system is responsible for a lot of physical inactivity, and it's also responsible for a lot of environmental impacts that are likely to have health impacts later down the line. So, but I think someone summarized the situation really well in the conference yesterday, and this is someone who works as a doctor, said at this Cycle City Active conference in Bradford, currently what we're doing is we're allowing people to fall off a cliff and then we're fixing them afterwards. And he was saying, to continue the metaphor, we need to build fences to stop people falling off the cliff in the first place. And that's a slightly different, when you frame it like that, you readjust your priorities to ensure that we are ensuring that healthy lifestyles are just a part of everyday life. And that has the consequence that health funding needs to be much more about preventative health, and it needs to be about healthy lifestyles. This is well known, but it seems to be very slow to be getting into government policy. And just a comment on Sick Kids, which is kindly hosting this, good and bad health behaviours are learned very early on, and they're systemic. So it's actually, to some extent, once you get past a certain age, it's very difficult to change your behaviours. So getting people into healthy lifestyles early on is absolutely critical. So I think that the fact that Sick Kids as an organisation is looking into this preventative side of the health equation is actually very important. And it links to my research because we would like to spend more time looking at the propensity to cycle to school and where do we need to build safe routes to school rather than only focusing on adults. And this is something that I'm very conscious of, that our research is very much focused on adults, but the future generations are potentially the people who we should be targeting. So that's just a general kind of my take on how my research relates to health. So in terms of tools for planning healthy cities, obviously over time, the power of our tools and the amount of data that we have has increased exponentially. And in my view, that has meant that the models and the toolkits that we're using have become disproportionately more important over time. And I've just got a few examples of this. So a problem that is well known, certainly in the UK and in other places, is that long-term transport models tend to be very inaccurate, and they tend to have quite a limited view of the future in terms of scenarios. So the slide that I have up is showing how the DFT, this is the Department for Transport's forecasts for growth in car use, have consistently been overestimating the actual level of increase. And this suggests that we need to change the modelling outcome, because this is having real world impacts. local authorities in the UK who are using these kind of models are building in for increased car capacity, when in practice, certainly over the timescale represented in that graphic, that hasn't been the case. So models have real world implications, and it would be difficult to go back and suggest the exact health implications of these models being wrong, but the point is that they certainly do have health implications if it prevents people from investing in other modes. So there's an issue there with transport models, and I'm sure this issue with tools being fit for purpose and our ability to create alternative scenarios of the future is really important in the wider context. The good news is there are many good interactive online tools. So in Australia, they have something called AURIN, which is the Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network. And this is really trying to bring together many different data sources from across Australia, and they provide not just researchers but transport planners a single one-stop site to access data. So if you're interested in walkability, or you're interested in accessibility to the nearest hospital, you have all of your data there, and it's interactive, and you can even do some analysis online. So I think AURIN's an excellent example of the kinds of things that are possible now. AURIN is a major project, but I think over time, building these kind of cohesive and systematic data repositories and data analysis sites is becoming easier. A much smaller example is from a cycle path that I've ridden over the last couple of days, which goes from Leeds to Bradford. It's about 10 miles. And in the process of planning it, the consultants there, Steer Davies Gleave, put together an interactive map that just allowed residents to make their opinions known on an interactive map. And that way it led to a much more democratic planning process. So that is much lower cost, it's much faster, and with current online web mapping technology provided by open source software such as the Leaflet JavaScript package, that's much easier. And I've got another couple of examples. So the Department for Energy and Climate Change has got a 2050 planning tool. There's also, and this is having quite a big impact on house prices at the moment, the Walkability Index. And I was amazed to see that although this is focused on the USA, I could click on it and find out the walkability in my city of Leeds, and it came up with a 99% walkability score, which is very surprising because the city has a reputation for being totally car dominated. But I guess that it was talking about the Leeds city centre rather than Leeds overall. So there's all these tools that are becoming available, but my question is, to what extent are they being used and leveraged by policymakers who are actually making decisions and spending money that's going to affect the health of people for decades to come? So there are many tools online, but not many of them that I've seen are specifically focused on the question of health. And the tools that do exist, I suspect that they are not as publicly accessible as they could be. So that links to my next slide, which is just about the importance of open data and methods. And if the thinking behind it is, if the data underlying policy is hidden, it can be presented to push a certain aims, and that issue can be solved by open data. So the point there is, if you have politicians who aren't driven by the evidence, who are ideologically driven, the evidence should be able to put pressure on them to make the decisions that are most in line with the best available evidence. And that, to some extent, is solved by open data. However, if the data is open but the tools are closed, the results are still open to political influence. So if you've got a massive database that you open up, there's no way that members of the public or citizen groups can actually use that. It still isn't open access in the way that it could be. And that's why this talk is primarily about open access tools rather than open source tools, because something can be open source without being accessible to everyday people. So that's an important point. So that links on nicely to our next topic, which is a case study of the propensity to cycle tool, which is a publicly accessible online toolkit. And it's one of the first times that the Department for Transport, well, I think it is the first time that the Department for Transport has funded a toolkit that's completely open to the public scrutiny. And that is having a big impact. That has major implications for how it is being interpreted, and I think has greatly improved its impact beyond just the expert planners. So for a little bit of context, and I've said we started this in 2015, it actually goes back quite a lot longer than that. I did my PhD from 2009 to 2013, and I was using geographically disaggregated data. And I started running a few scenarios of change based on the methods that Petros mentioned in the introduction. And what I found was that the results of different policy scenarios were very geographically variable. So if you had a policy of telecommuting, which is simply working from home, I found that the energy benefits of that were much greater in some places than others. And that led to the idea of algorithms that could help detect which places on the map are the optimal for certain interventions. And one example of that is the idea of an algorithm for cycling uptake. The propensity to cycle tool, as you'll see, is quite different from that. And it was only really with the discovery of programming and being empowered by open source technology, such as developments in the R programming language and associated packages, that I realized that you could really scale up some of these methods and provide a systematic and hopefully objective evidence base for informing policy in this area. And I'm not going to go through all of these points, but essentially now we find ourselves in the position where we've published a paper on it. We have the propensity to cycle tool is being used by many local authorities across the UK, and it's now's a good point to step back and tell the story to some extent and think about some of the lessons learned. So what is propensity to cycle? Well, essentially, it's about saying not how many people are cycling currently, it's saying how many people could cycle given the appropriate policies. So that's why it's much more policy relevant than toolkits that just describe existing behavior. So there's a lot of analysis on bike share schemes and on Strava data that will show you a description of how things currently are, but cycling potential, and this word propensity says what could happen in the future. So that's the key difference. And for that reason, we really depend on data that's systematic and representative of the whole population rather than just a subset of it, because most people currently don't cycle. And primarily, it's about where interventions are most needed based on currently cycled trips. It's had some policy impacts. I'm not going to read through these quotes because I want to crack on, but it's certainly at the national level, politicians are aware of it, and local authorities are using it to design strategic cycling networks. So it's really had much more of an impact than we were expecting, and it's only just been launched. So really exciting times for the research. And just to put it in context of other tools for prioritizing cycling intervention, we did a literature review, and it's interesting to see that actually only 2 of the other tools that we found came from the academic literature. We had to go into the grey literature and also look at proprietary tools developed by companies to do the same job. And what this table shows is basically a comparison between the propensity to cycle tool and some of the other toolkits that are available, that were available when we did the research. So there's one actually based in Canada, in Montreal, which is GIS based, and that operates at the individual participant level and at the area level and at the route level. And there's another one that I would like to highlight from Transport for London. That's the bottom one. That's the cycling potential tool. And that just is based at the area level. So what we did when we looked at this is we realized that policymakers need to make decisions based on information at various geographical levels. And the final, just to clarify what these acronyms mean, the final level was the route network level. So that's the RN. And that links to a whole body of literature that says that cycling policies should revolve around the idea of a joined up network rather than specific schemes or specific routes, which has been how historically cycle planning has evolved. So there's a nice kind of overlap between the development of our tool, and in parallel, the literature has built on it, and I've got a reference in there on network level planning. Another difference is that the propensity to cycle tool works nationwide, so it actually scales to the level of England. It's provided on an online map so that anyone, members of the public, can come and use it. And it's highly interactive, and it's based on open source software. So other people can take this and build it for other areas, and it also makes it easier for ourselves to extend it to other regions, which is something that we want to do and improve it over time. So that's a bit of an overview of how the propensity to cycle tool compares with existing tools. And it's important to say that this is a team effort. So I'm the lead developer of the propensity to cycle tool, but it's also got academics from a wide range of other universities. And that's been a really important part of the development of the propensity to cycle tool. If it was only one type of person, we wouldn't have been able to get where we've got to. So that multidisciplinary element is actually really important. So I'm going to crack on and actually get to a live demo of this thing. So I've got other slides in there about how it works, but given the time limitations and the fact that I would really like to get some questions towards the end, I'm going to get to a live demo to show how it works in real life. So you can actually use this from anywhere in the world. You can, and the website is just www.pct.bike. So I'm going to open up a new window here. And the first thing it shows you is just an overview. And the point here is look what could happen in the future. So it's to some extent a backcasting tool where we're saying if we got to Dutch levels of cycling, or if we got to this scenario level of cycling, this is how it might look based on current trip patterns. And obviously it varies from place to place because in some areas it's very hilly and trip distances are too far to be cycled. In other places it's very flat. So that already helps you think about the prioritization of funding before you go down to the level of individual regions and cities. But the actual propensity to cycle tool itself operates at the regional level. So I've just clicked on West Yorkshire, which is where I'm based in Leeds, and it shows you a map that's interactive, and you can zoom in, just showing you what the level of cycling is. And you can see here, it's largely red. West Yorkshire has got the lowest level of cycling of all the regions in our tool based on the 2011 census. But going back to this concept of scenarios, we can use a model to estimate how things could be in the future. So it's not just about planning specific routes, it's also envisioning a future where cycling becomes the natural choice for short trips. So under the government target, it roughly doubles, but it doesn't double in all areas. If we go to the Go Dutch scenario here, you can see that you've got basically a transformation in the transport system of Leeds. And you can see that where the blue areas are, which represents 15% or more trips made by cycling, still they only exist near the city centres and where facilities are close by. And that shows that it's a kind of realistic take on it, rather than assuming that everywhere is going to have 30% of trips made by bike. And I should point out at this stage that the Go Dutch scenario is not based on the highest level of cycling in the Netherlands. It's based on the average level across all of the Netherlands. And even in the Netherlands, there are areas that are very highly car dependent. Not everywhere in the Netherlands has high levels of cycling. Just to go into the visualization a little bit, which is really where what we've done is quite new in terms of the online interactive interface. We can visualize this in terms of the straight lines, and we can see under this future where cycling is much more common than it is today, where would those people cycle? And we can represent those at the desire line level. But we can also, what we did, which is quite new compared with other toolkits for analysing cycling potential, is we actually allocated those onto the route network, which is what we're currently seeing. If we freeze the lines that are currently on the map and zoom in, we can see that we're getting a lot of overlap between the different lines. And that's problematic because when you keep increasing it, you just get quite a mess. You can't actually see what's going on. So that makes it difficult to plan simply because you've got too much data. So the way that we solve this problem, which to some extent is just a data processing problem or visualization problem, is we aggregated all of these thousands of routes onto the road network. And I'm going to make the zones disappear so it highlights this network. And as a first approximation, this gives you a pretty good idea of what a strategic cycling network could look like within the city. And if I just zoom out, you can see that this works all across England, and we can zoom in to that same level of detail for any city. And that's really the power of what we've done. And as I say, it is being used. It doesn't provide a golden bullet, and it provides a kind of overview of which routes have the greatest potential to see uptake, but you still need the skill of the planner to decide what precisely needs to be built. So the propensity to cycle tool overall is about where should you build your investment, where should you invest, not so much what you should invest. So there's been a few recent additions. Going back to the Sick Kids sponsorship of this, or hosting rather, of this talk, we've got a prototype version of the travel to schools layer, which I think is really exciting. I think building safe routes to schools should be a priority in a sustainable transport system, and we are hoping to scale that up. And the point to make there is that actually you get a very different geographical distribution when you overlay it with cycling to work. So the propensity to cycle tool as it currently stands is only based on commute data from the 2011 census. When we overlay that with schools, cycling to school potential, you can see that there's there's actually quite a low level of geographical correlation, which means that you need to take into account where schools are and where shops are if you're going to build a network that isn't just about one type of person. And what I just presented is the LSOA layer. And this is a really big data problem that my colleague Malcolm Morgan has solved by rasterizing 4 million routes. So that was a massive challenge that he took on. I won't go into the technical details, but it's sufficient to say it's resulted in an academic paper which is currently in press. Very quickly, where do we go from building the propensity to cycle tool? Well, as I say, we've been focusing up till now on the question of where is the potential and where to invest, but increasingly local authorities are coming to us and saying, okay, well, that's useful, but still, how can this inform our decisions of where to build new cycle infrastructure? Should we build Dutch-style cycle superhighways here, or is this a place where we're best just building some light segregation where we might get more value for money, or should we do some space reallocation? That's the question that we're currently working on, and this is a very recently started project called the Cycling Infrastructure Prioritization Toolkit. And there's a little schematic diagram there that shows how we're taking data from multiple sources, classifying potential interventions and classifying the barriers to cycling, and then we're going through an evaluation phase that ultimately should result in estimates of benefit cost ratios for potential interventions across the route network. So this is a really ambitious project that builds on the propensity to cycle tool. So that's an overview of my research, but the final thing to talk about before we open it up to questions is, where do we go from here? What has the experience of creating an open access online toolkit for informing policy? What are the lessons that I've learned that hopefully will be useful to the audience? Well, one of the things is, what didn't we use? So a lot of people are surprised when they see the level of detail in the propensity to cycle tool that we didn't actually use new forms of data. We just used the 2011 census or other large-scale origin destination data sets that are available. And I think there's a huge potential to use big data or crowdsourced data in here. And the graphic that illustrates this concept is just showing a comparison between the results of the propensity to cycle tool and Strava. And you can see that there is a high level of correlation, certainly in the most commonly used cycle route in Leeds, which is Otley Road, going up to the northwest. But if you were to follow religiously the Strava heat map, you'd probably build a cycle path into the countryside. So you really need to understand where your data is coming from. And if you are using these big data sources, make sure that they account for potential biases in the population, where the data comes from. So from my perspective, I really like officially collected data because it's likely to be most representative of people from all walks of life, and that links to equalities. Going back to what I said about design for networks, not specific schemes, I think this also relates to health policy. Don't just silo your research and do a single and targeted intervention. See how you can link it up more broadly and connect different parts of the health environment together. So that's a kind of analogy I'm drawing between the whole cycle network rather than a single scheme, and specific health interventions rather than embedding your health interventions within wider policies. In terms of the transport policy, there's a real need to be more strategic, and but there's also a need to be experimental. And I think for too long, people have been very, very conservative in what they're willing to do, especially in the health area. But actually, there's a huge potential for doing small experiments where you change things in the local environment, monitor them, and get feedback. So I'm definitely not saying that because we can do model experiments, we don't need to do tests in the real world or be innovative in real world. I'm saying that actually those two things can work hand in hand. If your computer model is suggesting a certain intervention, the next stage is to rapidly test it in reality to see if it works. And this is what is increasingly happening in transport. So it's really exciting to see policymakers introducing what are called traffic regulation orders, monitoring them, and if they're successful, continuing them and expanding them, and if they're not, try something else. So that's just a point on being willing to experiment. So I believe you'll be happy to hear that this is my final slide. And I would just like to end with some recommendations, which are really kind of ideas, because as I say, I'm not an expert in the health field, but I'm sure that there are strong lessons that can be learned from my research that are applicable to the audience. So use existing online interactive tools. Don't be afraid to kind of step outside the box, just see what's out there. And a good example of this is Google Maps. You can get a huge amount of information and insight about the local environment just by using Google Maps and Street View. Whether that's systematic data or not, at the outset, doesn't matter. It can generate ideas and it can tell you about local environments. But increasingly, there are large data sets and in some cases, global data sets that could be relevant. So just have a look and see what's out there. Design for the long term, have a vision and prioritize it rather than just going for small specific interventions. And this is something that the propensity to cycle tool enables, having a long-term vision and seeing specific interventions as part of this wider vision, and be adaptive, basically. And that links to my previous slide about traffic regulation orders. To take a specific example from transport, get yourself and your team skilled up with open source software. The only reason that the propensity to cycle tool was possible and able to scale is because we used what I would call an agile workflow. We used some of the latest open source software that was coming up online. So don't underestimate the importance of software. And if it's open source, it's likely to be reproducible. And that's what makes it scientific and, in my view, more democratic, because other people can reproduce your results and ensure transparency. And the final thing is just collaborate, work together and see this as a team effort rather than competing with different people. And that way we can build on the shoulders of giants much more than everyone reinventing the wheel. So that's my final comment on it. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I'm happy to say I've left some time for questions. So thanks a lot for listening.
Yeah, you can see as soon as you start speaking, it switches to us. Okay, so you fixed the problem is fixed? Yeah, we had to import the other.
Okay, so thank you very much, Robin. Unless there are questions from the online people, I would like to ask a question first before I open it to questions. And the main question I have is that this seems like a very interesting tool, but especially from our side, it would be very interesting to see the outcome of a change. Right? Usually, at least in health science, we are used to seeing what would happen if an intervention would be to be implemented, what would happen in the health or environmental or economic outcomes. And I was wondering whether you can say something about that and the ability of a model like yours to capture that.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that. That's a very good question. And I deliberately didn't go into the health modeling side of the propensity to cycle tool because that's not my focus as the lead developer. That we are working with health modelers on the tool, primarily James Woodcock and Anna Goodman. And I just want to zoom in to show you the kind of things that the results can tell you. So let's just rewind and have a look. Can you still see the screen okay, Petros?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. So we are going to go back in time. So we're in Go Dutch land now, where you've got very high levels of cycling. Let's go back to 2011, and you can see there's much lower levels. This is about 10 times less cycling than what it could be. Also, what we're going to do is show the route network. So just to make this clear, I'm only going to show the top 6 routes, and I am getting to your question. I'm just using this as a way to demonstrate the health impacts. So currently, we've got the 6 most cycled routes, and we can see that the most cycled route in Leeds only has 105 people. If we go back to the Go Dutch scenario, you can see that this same line is still here. Even though it's relatively smaller, it's increased massively to 301 people are cycling. And what we have in here, this is the important numbers, we have a change in deaths per year and an economic benefit. So these numbers, again, this isn't my expertise on the project, but this comes from the World Health Organization's heat model, where we are using the distance of the trip, and we're estimating how many times people cycle it, and the increase in activity patterns against a baseline leads to quite a high uptake in cycling. And what we can also do is show, we can order these lines by the increase in cycling, by the heat values, which is the health impact of cycling. And when we switch to that, you can see that there's a shift in the geographical distribution towards longer trips. And that's because when you cycle further, you get more exercise. So we're really modeling this on quite a detailed level as a consequence of having this model that is down to the route network level based on origin destination data. So yes, we are modeling this, and you can imagine when you add together all of those thousands of lines, what you can get out of it. And I'm going to go back to the area level data, is you can actually estimate what the health benefits are for each zone. So you can see we're estimating the change in amount of CO2, and we're also estimating the health benefits in monetary terms over time. So yes, we are modeling it, and I should have said more of that in the slides. Does that answer your question? Feel free to ask follow-on questions, Petros.
Yeah, that's super useful. Yeah, that's very useful. Yeah, I'm gonna let the others ask questions, and if there's anything online or from here. Any questions here? No. And online, no one. Okay, then I can ask again. I remember reading a paper of yours that there was, I don't think it's a published paper, but a reading paper, that you try to convert to use DALIs in the process.
DALIs, yeah.
Right? So are these calculations of health implication, can you incorporate quality of life somehow in this process of calculating the health benefit, rather than only focusing on the mortality? So how?
Yeah. So this is disability adjusted life years. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think for myself, my personal view is that disability adjusted life years is actually more important than deaths per year, because this really kind of takes into account the quality of life that you have, and whether you're able to meet your own needs, whether you're able to be independent. And I think that is definitely, I can understand the motivation for asking that question. All I would say is that it depends very much on the quality of health models and the quality of the data that health models are based on. So we can tell you how many more people cycle to work. What you need to do to convert that into a change in DALIs over time is actually quite a complex process. So yes, it is possible to make a first approximation, but I think in order to get a sophisticated understanding of the change, you would need to have a temporal element in your modeling. So just to say, oh, this is the instantaneous effect is not the same as saying this is the long-term impact. So my approach would be to do what they do in environmental science, in climate change modeling, and they measure the global warming potential over time. So they'll say the 50-year global warming potential or the 5-year. And I would suggest that a sophisticated way of measuring DALYs would involve saying, over the next 5 years, this is the impact. Over the next 50 years, and then obviously you could integrate over the whole lifetime of the project, but you'd really need to take that into account. And that's the reason why I'm slightly hesitant about showing the health impacts first, because it's obviously a complex topic and it involves making certain assumptions. So overall, yes, I think it's a very good idea, but I would say with the caveat that the person doing that modelling should really take into account the assumptions on which it's based and the fact that this has a temporal element that may not be represented in just a spatial model, which is what the propensity cycle tool is.
I see. Thank you. So if there are no other questions, and it's 2 o'clock, so thank you very much for coming, and for those that attended online. Robin, thank you very much for the presentation, very interesting. And next week is our last THETA round for the year. So hope to see you either online or physically here next week. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you very much, everyone.